Abby Gates, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Brian. It's good to see you.
Awesome. Super good to see you too. All right. So typically how I start the podcast here is I will jump into a hot take topic. And I think this one is very relevant for you, for what you do with SproutWise. So the topic is on AI and lean teams. So everywhere you look, founders are saying, let's do with 5 people what it used to take 20 people to do. Big companies like IBM, Amazon, Salesforce, and Klarna are either planning or announcing thousands of white collar job layoffs. We just saw a handful recently. At the same time, there's an economist that I follow, Daniel Altman, who writes in his High Yield Economics newsletter that while AI is clearly reshaping white collar jobs and contributing to headline job cuts, the broader data shows low unemployment and relatively stable labor demand. So my question for you here is, if you were helping a founder design an actually healthy AI native organization from 10 to 75 people, what would you do differently in their people systems and team structure than traditional startups that are just trying to do more with less people?
It is a very timely question. We spend a lot of time thinking about this because the kinds of companies we tend to engage with have to consider things like this, because the types of decisions these organizations are making at the time we engage with them sometimes are survival based. These are early stage organizations that have these very, very broad roles across their executive teams, across their small teams if they have them today. And so when we think about something like AI, oftentimes it is through the mindset of what kinds of people tend to choose those organizations to begin with. And there are some key behaviors that we tend to want to see. We call them good startuppers. And a part of the work we tend to do is really kicking it back to the beginning of the employment journey, which is what are the kinds of people that join your organization that tend to flourish? And it tends to be a little bit of the values discussion, how your team works and collaborates with one another. It's the runway of how much might these employees have the opportunity to do, what sort of problems or opportunities are in front of them or your organization. And when we think about something like AI, again, these positions are likely being hired because they're non-negotiable. These are all crucial roles that have to be done. And so AI in these instances often becomes a way to accelerate the value someone might bring to an organization. So when we think about a good startupper, there's natural intellectual curiosity. There is this possibility mindset when we think about staring down problems or opportunities in front of you. And someone had recommended this book to me recently, and it's just been this powerful reminder of this kind of work in these organizations. And it juxtaposes a possibility versus a probability mindset. And the idea here is, and the book is using this when we think about how the public sector makes decisions. And ordinarily, you'll see a probability mindset or approaching problems with solutions that have the highest probability of success. And what that typically means is these are really standard solutions. These are tried and true solution paths. These are widely accepted as the best path forward. Just, on average, these have the highest probability of success. When we think about possibility thinking and startups, you might see a greater number of opportunity if you allow yourself to think through what might be possible if we consider this problem from every angle. Now, a lot of those solutions may in fact be duds, but there might be solutions that we come up with as an organization or with these types of resources that are so head and shoulders above and so much potentially more successful for the organization, for the industry, that kind of thing. So when we think about how AI might play into that, it's, again, how might we accelerate the value at an executive team level if we give these folks joining these organizations the ability to employ and consider these tools and how it might accelerate that solution. It really frees up their time potentially on tasks that don't bring that value, and also might bring new ways of thinking, out of the box thinking, to a team that is probably pretty lean and thinking through problems that likely have to be solved very quickly. So in my estimation, it is thinking through how might you integrate this kind of thinking with AI, for instance, within how you're choosing people to join your organization. Have they naturally tinkered around or integrated these tools within the way that they think? Because I think it does give an indication of, again, intellectual curiosity. The moment is here. We don't have a choice whether AI is going to affect work or whether it isn't. It already is. And I see this in the same way as the Industrial Revolution, for instance. If you resisted it, it was going to happen and going to evolve with or without you. And it's sort of this adapt or die moment of this is a groundbreaking moment in the way that we work. Now, use it to help make your work even better. And that's the general sense that I would coach these teams on, thinking through the employment journey or the employee life cycle rather, and integrating those kinds of thinking, that kind of problem solving within an organization.
That's an interesting take. So these startuppers that you're talking about, are these sort of the intrapreneurs in an organization that are sort of like the CEO of their lane or something like that? Is that kind of what you're saying there?
Exactly. And I
Okay.
think there are those resources that really thrive in that kind of environment. And you're right, like they might have had, and there are instances, I'll give you an example of a current client today. We work with this construction technology organization called VeroTouch, and they're really bringing a brand new technology to a historically resistant industry that hasn't changed for a very, very long time. And some of the tradespeople they've brought into this organization to lead some of these disciplines, for instance, an electrical or HVAC or that kind of discipline, these are people that have likely had their own businesses prior. And so they're joining these organizations because of this potential for impact. And they're joining these organizations as someone who has understood how to build their own organization and what that takes. And so, yes, like that's an example where we've seen explicit entrepreneurship that then dovetails into entrepreneurship. But by and large, we tend to see that very similar mindset in standard tech companies. And I've seen it throughout my career where there is a great investment in problem solving because startuppers tend to have great visibility into the organization. They are often invited into the folds, and the future of the organization sits squarely on the shoulders of everyone in it. So absolutely, I feel like I'm going to start using entrepreneurship in the way that I explain this to organizations. It's a great term.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's interesting because something that has been also timely in certain discussions I've been having recently, there are some more seasoned executives who have asked some people recently about like, should I be worried about my kids getting jobs, right? Because AI is starting to show signs of being able to replace these sort of repeatable early entry level kind of work from software engineers or accounting or different things that people are starting to explore. And so I guess kind of building off of the last question is like, are you worried about the sort of up and coming generation and the sort of entry level workforce student who's getting ready to graduate or who recently graduated to find a job? And I guess that's the first part is, are you worried? And then the second part would be, what kind of advice would you give to those early career folks to sort of develop that possibility mindset is what I think you're trying to say, right? Like you want to have predictable plausibility to de-risk certain decisions in your organization, but the possibility mindset is what really leads to innovation in the adapt or die mindset. So what would you, I guess that's a two-parter for you.
It's a excellent question for starters, and I'm staring off into space because I'm thinking through it in a couple of different ways. I think it would accelerate seniority in some of these tech adept resources coming out of school, meaning they'll get there so much faster than we likely did when we graduated from school. And so I do think there is this opportunity to establish more impact and value because of just how tech savvy they might be. And I do think in the short term, might it mean that it's hard to find those positions potentially, though I think there's this marketability of those skills. This is now a native way of thinking for this generation. And so I think we might have seen this very massive course correction in layoffs, for instance, if they're happening across organizations. though I think we'll start to see this level out in terms of opportunity as we adapt to what AI brings into the fold. And so my recommendation would be play around with these tools. And I say that because we already are, again, out of necessity. My organization, for instance, we're a really small outfit. We don't have the budget to hire full-time roles and or even arguably fractional support. And so when I think about how I've had to use these tools, like I use ChatGPT almost as a COO or a chief of staff. And I've come up with ways to adapt it to my processing style. And so, for instance, and I'll give some examples here. If I am thinking through something, an idea, and trying to process it in real time, I have a bracketed prompt for thinking. So it'll help me arrive at a conclusion. If I am exploring systems within my organization, finance systems was a huge theme for me in 2025. And I joke that I put myself through finance boot camp, but it was how can I create a system that allows for automation, accounts for capacity, and understands my business that works with how we work. And so the bracket there would be systems. If I'm drafting things, I often use it to draft emails or responses and ensure it's in my voice tone and writing style. Drafting would be the prompt. And then all of that manifests into an asset. So all of that thinking, drafting, systems work ends up being exported into a folder of things that I'll use that are driving projects that go live. Now, 20 years ago, that would have required probably a team of maybe 3 and 4 people to achieve. And collaboration was, harder to arrive at because you've got to get many minds in a room thinking through those things. So the acceleration of that and the way that I'm thinking is so much faster now, and I'm able to synthesize information that much more quickly. And so my recommendation is to play around with those things. Vibe coding, also something we've started to play around with because there are budget constraints with rebranding, for instance, in 2026. Recommendation would be playing around with those things with the opportunities in front of you, like exploring and going down those thought processes live with like an AI tool of some kind, and playing around with, can we arrive at something that helps to get me closer to creating opportunity for myself? So it has given this much wider chance for early stage students who have the time and arguably have the risk tolerance at that stage in their career to start to use these things in a more playful way. Because, for someone like you or I, we're already established in our careers. There has to be tight guardrails on these things because I have a family. There are many, many obligations sitting squarely on my shoulders. And yet I've still integrated this into what I'm doing. And in my case, it's out of necessity. But give yourself the room to run and play, I would say, and using these tools.
I think that's really great advice and overall very interesting insights on how you're using the tools of AI today to help you achieve more and outsized outcomes than would have been possible 5 to 10 years ago. And I think it makes me think about the ways that I'm using the tools today too, and the ways that I'm seeing others use it as well. And I think for me, it's really interesting because, I graduated during COVID years. So the whole Zoom, hybrid work environment was very just natural feeling to me in a weird way. It just kind of evolved into my life. And I remember there was one day I was going to classes and one day I was taking it online, and that was it. It was sudden, but also it didn't feel abrupt in an interesting way. And I think the same thing is happening with AI. Is I can't remember the first time that I heard about ChatGPT, but it feels like there's a life before it and there's a life after it, right? Like the things that I'm able to accomplish every single day. And so what I've been able to do is build a Notion, basically headquarters for the things that I do that have SOPs, system operating procedures that I use, and a playbook that I run for different functions that are repeatable that I do every day. And I think that's where you're seeing AI really thrive right now, and people really diving in is those drafting the emails, writing some copy for a LinkedIn post, spinning up a business plan or things like that. And I think what's coming next that a lot of people are already engaging with, but I think will become more mainstream is how do I become a mini software engineer within my role,
Yeah,
like spinning up a website or a landing page without needing a design team and an engineer and all of these things. Like you can do
exactly.
that now effectively. And I think, honestly, to your point, with students or younger people who are just trying entering the workforce, like these are going to be some of the smartest people that we've probably ever had in the workforce because they're growing up with it natively. They're able to have these generalist skill sets that enable them to do so many different functions. And I think it's really going to, as once we see more and more of these entry level roles open up for these kind of generalist positions, you're going to start to see people accomplish so many interesting things,
Yeah,
which I think will also lead to more and bigger, more complex problems too
right.
down the line. So I think that the data is showing, the technical revolution that we experienced, the industrial revolution, it's no different now. Yes, it wipes out some jobs, but then new jobs are created, new
Yeah,
innovations are happening, new things are possible that you didn't even think were possible before.
yeah.
So it's just interesting to see where things are evolving there, being in the
It
startup
really
land
is.
like we are.
Yeah, there's another aspect of this that also, as I'm thinking through this, has been pretty powerful. I also think AI, because I'll often speak to ChatGPT and ask it point blank to challenge me. And what I think it's helped me to do is identify my own gaps that much more quickly and understand if I have this many limitations, if it takes this long to use this tool in order to figure it out, figure something out, whatever it might be, what are my options for considering whether it's other resources or is this such a glaring gap for me that I should explore having someone else who is more naturally inclined toward these things? So I think it helps me to, one, know enough to be dangerous so that I can engage thoughtfully on some of these topics, but also understand where I currently stand, where excellence lies, and when I need to, it's a know when to hold them, know when to fold them calculation, which is there is someone out there better positioned or someone or something out there better positioned to solve for this than I can. And so it does create this safe space to be vulnerable and explore those limitations and arrive at self-awareness there. And so I think it's also made those discussions so much more thoughtful for me because I know where I stand. It doesn't remain a mystery. If I go down the rabbit hole enough, I really have a very good understanding of where I live and where I thrive and where I need support in order to do something well.
So let's use that as a transition point here to talk a little bit more about your career journey and basically I want to jump right into your thought process on why jump into a startup right at this point in your life. So I guess the question here is that you have around 20 years of experience in HR and tech, right? You've been through some exits as well with certain companies. So we're going to come back to that later. But I wanted to ask you about the patterns that you see in organizations, both large and small, that convince you to build a firm dedicated to people systems for startups.
Yes to that. I think hindsight has been a massive gift here to help me connect those dots even more, especially after I'd founded my organization. And I say that because for the first, 15 years of my career working with these early stage organizations, there was a lot of similarities in terms of industry, largely software-based platforms, engineering forward cultures, a lot of consistency with how those teams were funded, built, and the pace of growth. And what's been interesting is that as I started SproutWise and now worked with organizations that would have never hired me before, there was a 0% chance that an architecture firm in Denver, Colorado, or a nonprofit based in Shreveport, Louisiana, would have ever entertained having someone like me at the helm of their people team because of my background. And I think what we've seen now is this consistency with people problems and opportunities at organizations, regardless of industry, regardless of size, wherever those employees are located. And so it wasn't until after SproutWise that I actually substantiated the things that I'd seen and felt firsthand as a full-time operator in these organizations. And I think what those tend to be are, even if growth is quite slow, or even if it's very, very fast, an organization will hit a moment where, again, you recognize your own limitations from a standpoint of not just the people space, but other functions. But in our case, it tends to be leaders assume they understand or have enough of an understanding of the people around them that they tend not to invest in a people function. Like they can sort of grin and bear it or muscle their way through and do enough well to get them to a point of growth. Because at an early stage, these organizations, again, are investing in survival. We need to get a viable product out there. We need to sell enough of it to enable the rest of this growth to happen. And again, that holds true whether we're talking about community-based volunteer programs or if we're talking about a software that's being sold in the market. And what often tends to happen is that the investment in the structure and the system supporting people lags behind that, again, out of necessity. There's no malice here. And I don't use this as some sort of opportunity to solve for the trauma I felt in my career. But the investment in people infrastructure also has come last or nearly last in building these departments within these organizations, almost without fail. And so I've often said that I'm not typically brought in as a full-time resource until companies get to about 50 or 75 people to solve for these things. But what tends to happen, and what I've seen, is that there is this accumulation of people debt. There is this accumulation of ad hoc processes or things that have been done that now manifest in like some sort of chaos or an event, like some sort of, why can't I think of the word? Um, some sort of calamity. And that tends to be, there's a sensitive people situation, a sensitive exit. There is tension amongst teams. It is now impeding delivery. And so we start to see the hard metrics now affected by some of the like softer people scenarios happening internally at an organization. And or in the tech world, it was we saw some sort of capital infusion into the organization, usually via a round of funding. So now it was, okay, now we have to grow quickly, hire lots of people, mature systems, build them very quickly, all at the same time. At some scale, that tends to happen at virtually any organization we've now partnered with. And so the intention with SproutWise was, if hiring someone full-time or building out a people team is something that is invested in later, there's typically a cost component there. So can we make this approachable from an economic standpoint to make this level of leadership and structure feel more justifiable earlier in the process of growth? And also meeting them where they are. I would never advise an organization that's at 5 people to fully build out a performance management framework, identify a tool in order to build a cadence and rigor around those tools. We have to meet those organizations at the point that they are. So we often talk about this as establishing your starting line as an organization. And I'll give some examples. Like, there are some teams that we've worked with, for instance, where you might have a group of executives, and this is a true story, that share a living space. They all live in the same place. There's 5 of them sharing a physical residence. And 2 of those folks, again, sitting on the executive team in this organization, now live together. Or they not live together, they're engaged. So they're engaged, living amongst a group of people that they're building an organization with. They are sharing their personal space with. And that sort of dynamic now informs the starting line, which is, are we addressing some of those dynamics of your early culture at a leadership level versus an organization that might be, they're dealing with some of these processes that are already fully built. They're arguably rather mature in terms of how they operate, but now we're talking refinement, and we might be getting into things like role clarity, building out some structure in terms of compensation if we're seeing an acceleration of hiring. And so we tend to see this path of consistency, but it is preempted by this. Is it a calamity-based or opportunity-based investment in the people function at all? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense, because something that you talked about was this paradox of viability and underinvestment, where you start to see these companies that are starting to generate revenue, they're raising capital, they're hiring quickly, and they start to overlook, in your words, they start to overlook the people systems that they're building, because they often see HR systems kind of as a cost center and not a revenue driver. And to your point about surviving versus like scaling and getting to a point of thriving. So I think it does make sense. And I think your example is pretty interesting and hits home with me, because I actually lived with both a startup founder. I was helping run the sales and marketing functions for an early stage startup that was under definitely under 10 people. Maybe it was between 5 and like 7 people, one founder. We lived together for 3 months in Ann Arbor as we were scaling. And it was kind of funny because I was just trying to be scrappy and he had an open room. I didn't pay rent. And it was good for our relationship in the sense of it really helped us be close to each other for quick decisions, for rapid growth, and things like that. It also gave me a sense of like, who is this person not in work? Like, is this, the type of person that I want to build a personal relationship with? Do we spend time together doing that? And, I have very high respect for the founder I worked with. We definitely had very different living styles. And so that kind of clashed a little bit. It definitely clashed a little bit because I was very focused on my health and well-being, and we had opposite sleep schedules. So, I mean, that's, hard to deal with. And then I also lived with my previous co-founder as well. So we lived together in a 1-bedroom, 1-bathroom apartment where he literally was in the living room full time. And that's just because that's what we had to do to scrap and to survive at that point. But then we eventually got to a point where, we were able to have our own spaces. But those are challenging dynamics to navigate, and I know that that's probably a little bit more extreme than the types of situations you deal with in the orgs that you support.
Early culture building in an organization, to not consider the personal dynamics, I would argue it almost is it is akin to a courting period with someone you might marry, because it is a professional marriage in a lot of ways. You are investing so much of yourself personally and professionally. And when we think about, and I keep coming back to values because it's true, we're going to do an exercise with a couple of organizations actually next week, which is understanding at a basic level, and a lot of this plays in personally, what is important to you and the way that you approach your work, because it's often very similar to the way you approach relationships in your life. What are some non-negotiables? Because from that either breeds lovely collaboration and we see accelerated problem solving, or you're starting to identify ways that there's misalignment in how decisions are made, transparency in how decisions are made, whether they're made at all, who makes those decisions. And so coming back to some of those ideas and now using that as the bar that you hold when you're choosing who to join your organization, those are not unimportant facets. They really do underpin all of these other substantial revenue generating ways that an organization scales and thrives. They're just harder to define. And that's what we're after doing, which is there are ways to substantiate culture. There are ways to measure those things. There are ways to account for some of those ways that it might get a little hard. There are ways to coach people in having hard conversations and doing so thoughtfully. There are ways to accommodate growth and understanding that what you want today, if you're in a co-founder relationship, might be different than 6 months or a year from now. It might be different next week because of the pace of how these organizations think about things. And that sort of culture element is, in my opinion, humble opinion, is as important to the product you're building and also the way you bring it to market and see revenue materialize.
100%. Yeah, it's the scale of growth for early stage companies, not necessarily as early as I was, right? Where it's like 2 people plus a contractor. Like that's super small and super early. But even as organizations are growing, like, and, hitting 10 to 30 employees to 50 employees, like if you are co-founders in your mid-30s and have relationships and you're starting to get married or starting to have kids or things like that, your priorities change. And so I think it's really important, to your point of like maybe just have like a co-founder upfront contract or something like that you can come back to on how do we make decisions on X, Y, and Z, like from a personal level even. And the thing about it too for first-time founders is they don't really know what they're going to be up against unless they kind of go through it, right? So that's where kind of having the wisdom of, either being a multi-time founder second time, third time, or someone like you or an organization like SproutWise to come in and be like, these are the potential challenges that you're going to run into here. Let's start the conversation early before necessarily you're ready, knowing that a series A is coming down the pipeline. Like, you're not maybe quite there for us yet, but I can start to advise you and counsel you so that when you get to that point, we can help make sure that you're set up for long-term success.
Yeah. And I also find that the way I can engage with teams to convey those themes so much different now that I work in this way. Because think about it, as a head or a VP of people, whatever title we're talking about, same sort of role. When I come into an organization, there are also other things that remain true. I tend to slot into an advisor for fellow executive team members. It's a lonely place to be, and there's not a lot of safe places for them to be. These are probably not teams that have the capital to invest in executive coaches or having that sort of safe space to say, this is hard and I'm not sure how to solve for those things. And it also tends to be something I do for the broader team as well. And so I tend to hear a lot of these like vulnerable moments. I tend to hear ideas on ways that we can think about moving through those opportunities. And I think I can be far more candid in saying, you're getting in your own way, or these are things that need your attention because this will happen. When I'm a full-time employee, I do report to a CEO. There is some self-preservation there because my own success rests with that sort of perception, how I'm performing. When I work in this way, especially in a retainer, we signed a contract for a period of time. There is commitment there. I am just enough removed that I can act as an advisor and be pretty objective about reads in the situation, and preserve decision making, and move along the path of the right step, with going by it honest and having the freedom to do that. It has been very freeing in my work to say, you're making this harder on yourself, or some of these themes sit with you and or this executive team. This is something that we need to invest ourselves in solving. This is not a rank and file issue. This is not we can't blame it on something outwardly. The team is looking to you to solve these things, and we're making it harder to do that. So being able to approach a team in that way and be far more candid is, in my opinion, it's been a much easier and better way for me to leverage this expertise.
I would imagine that it's also pretty rewarding to work with so many different organizations, right? Having spent, a lot, like years and years inside of organizations in the employee role, to now coming in as sort of this third-party organization that's helping to facilitate those conversations and set up those processes. What is sort of the I guess, intention and plan for you and SproutWise kind of going into this year? How are you thinking about growth and scale? Are you intending it to be more of a lifestyle business? Like, where do you see SproutWise evolving over the course of the next year?
It has been something I've thought a lot about recently, especially as we started working with some of these organizations. And the question I've asked myself is, what happens if I really like working with one of these teams? Would I go back into that scenario where I invest more of my time and energy and perhaps even consider something in a full-time role if I find a team that I work particularly well with, if we've established a good working relationship and a good collaboration style? As far as where I'd love to see SproutWise go, there has been, in 2025, there was this huge investment in the Michigan ecosystem. And the thought there was, I've seen and have worked in ecosystems that are far more mature. And I don't say that as a knock on Michigan. It's just like the coastal VCs that were investing in the organizations I was a part of. There was more structure, there was more capital, there was more risk tolerance because they had already established themselves as a massive player in that space at all. And these organizations, some of the organizations I was a part of, did exit successfully. And so we've seen the flywheel there was just more established. And so when I think about 2025, it was an investment of time into trying to bring some of that expertise here. And I don't know if that will be as much a part of our strategy in 2026, simply because our revenue this year, our committed revenue, is already so lopsided. We've got revenue coming from virtually everywhere else but Michigan. And so I think 16% of our revenue, our committed revenue right now, is coming from the state of Michigan. And so just geographically, there's a lot of thought on that. Structurally, I love retained agreements and working as an embedded part of a team, because I think it does give us this unique opportunity to work alongside of those teams and co-create structure with them, as opposed to in a project sort of manner where we're point A, trying to get to point B, and then we roll off very quickly. And so I love these longer term, more embedded opportunities, and I'd love to see those become a bigger part of the mix, because I also think it's revenue stability too. It is hard to run a business. I talk about this through the lens of doing this work, but as a founder myself, there's a whole other half of my job, which is building and maintaining a stable and growing organization. It is the operations work. It is business development in order to keep a funnel full. It is all of the things that we do in order to fulfill our responsibility as a business at all. Uncle Sam doesn't care if I have commitments in Colorado and I'm building things for other organizations. I have to do those things for my own company today. Those longer tail engagements tend to give me a little breathing room on that, and give me the room to run there. So I guess the short-term answer to that is I'm not quite sure, but I do think I'll probably invest a whole lot more of my time in other ecosystems and explore those relationships, simply because the path to those sorts of organizations and partnerships and clients tends to be faster and more substantial, in all honesty.
All right. So I wanted to ask you about the stage appropriate system versus creating bureaucracy.
Mhm.
So a lot of founders will say we're too early for HR, right? In your view, I would be curious to know, what are the 3 non-negotiable people systems for companies between 5 and 20 employees?
I mean, there's the obvious payroll system. I don't know that I've encountered a founder that's trying to muscle their way through via a spreadsheet situation for payroll. It's just, you have to do it, and it is such a complexity that no one would want to take on themselves. And so, but when I also talk about payroll, there's some other things that come along with that too, which is compliance, and ensuring that at a basic level, this has to be something organizations have to think about. And it tends to be our gateway drug anyway with companies, which is we don't love it and you don't love it, but we have to care about it. You are depending on us to give you the freedom not to have to think about these things, because you're at a basic level, you are doing things that are appropriate and legal for how your team is running. And so a lot of these payroll systems tend to have like employee record management scenarios, or ways to build out things like handbooks or other policies and integrate those things directly into a payroll system. I'm thinking about things like PTO, and specifically for Michigan, it would be the ESTA law that was passed last year that mandated that employers of virtually all sizes had to have a sick time policy that allocated time for their employees to take. So again, it's one of those scenarios of we have to care about those things. So a payroll system is absolutely a non-negotiable, but we start to get into that HRIS discussion, which is a human resource information system. I think I've gotten that acronym right, and I would laugh so hard if I got it wrong. So fact check me, HR people who might listen to this. But in that system, you start to also have the opportunity to integrate other things which tend to crop up specifically between that like 15 to 20 range, which is the basics of doing jobs. There's a level of complexity that starts to get introduced when you think about adjacent teams working together. You probably have started thinking about a strategic plan at a firm level, which starts to trickle down into expectations, deliverables, OKRs for the rest of your team. So we start to get into that range of, can you articulate the North Star for your organization? And does your team understand what their role is in delivering against that? Because that's when you start to see a lot of this, like the culture concerns, we start to see cracks in the system, which is my job safe here? Because I'm not sure if what I'm doing is what I'm supposed to be doing or what is valuable. Are those conversations being accommodated? Are they being is it a priority to have them at all, and have some discussion about what's important to do. And those systems within an HRIS start to help organizations get some sense of method to the madness there, so they can articulate those things, track those things, and understand where they are. And especially when we start to introduce VC or any sort of funding into the mix, oftentimes those become the vehicle for reporting for a board and understanding, are we aligned with our mission as an organization and what you're expecting to deliver? So it's not just the soft, squishy culture stuff that's important when we talk about building those systems. It's also being able to report on and show progress being made by the organization against any sort of metrics a company might be held to delivering. And so, like payroll HRS, I'd also argue when you get to that point of especially the 20 range, we start to see some need for managing talent, and not just the talent you need to hire, but also having an easy way to re-engage with those folks who might have been a good fit for your organization, but you couldn't justify hiring them. Their background was really great when you got to a certain point. So accelerating your opportunity to find, manage, and re-engage with talent. So we start to see some need for an applicant tracking system, which for anyone not familiar, it's basically a candidate CRM. So same idea applies with a sales system, which is you want to be able to re-engage quickly with opportunities that bring you something to your organization. In the case of an ATS, it's talent, it's impact, it's the opportunity to deliver. Obviously, in the case of a sales team, it's revenue to continue to build your organization at all. But I certainly would say at that 15 to 20 mark, we're starting to see a need for being able to track that sort of element to your building strategy, because we're starting to see a need for headcount planning, role clarity, all of these things that start to crop up when complexity enters the game at that 20 mark.
That's a great rundown. I really appreciate that. And it seems like the function is very much this mix between a fractional COO, fractional CRO, and a fractional CFO, kind of all built into one, right? It's like you have to engage with all those kind of functions at the same time to build a resilient human resources division within your organization, making sure the cash flow is coming in, making sure that the finances are being managed properly, and making sure that the people and the processes that you have for growth are all kind of integrating into one cohesive environment.
Yeah. The other thing too is when I've categorized HR in the past, I've talked about being the glue in an organization. And I know earlier in the conversation, we talked a lot about being an emotional support animal or an advisor to the executive team. But the fact remains that when we talk about glue from a system standpoint, we have to establish partnership across every area of an organization, because our work cannot stand, we can't operate in a vacuum. We just can't. And I'll name some specific examples there. When we talk about working with finance and headcount planning, it does come down to, as an organization, what can we afford to hire? And also, what sort of incentives are we offering a team? So it is not just the base salary, but it's also a salesperson, variable compensation, bonus structures, equity. And so we can't design those systems on our own without the participation of finance, because that is someone who's understanding the overall health of an organization and survival from that standpoint. When we talk about hiring and or managing any employees in an organization, anyone who's been hired knows there are contracts in place at virtually every stage of that journey. When you receive an offer, that contract is written with lots of language around non-disclosure, IP protections, confidentiality, all of these things that you may gloss over. We have to work hand in hand with a legal resource in order to pull those things off. And also when there's separation agreements, if we have some sort of exit. Again, that's a document that we know enough to be dangerous and being able to draft, but we have to work with a legal team in order to pull off. And then any sort of hiring is done in participation with any lead of a department across the company. We can't manifest those plans without that partnership. So when we talk about the glue and how it comes back to the systems and collaboration across adjacent teams, we have to ensure that there is some cohesiveness across the needs of each of those departments within an organization. Again, are we aligned with the North Star? We understand our role in making those things happen, in advocating for the team that ultimately has to do that work. And so that glue piece is also absolutely crucial in establishing success. I've done it poorly in the past, earlier in my career, and I've also now understand the power of creating solid connection and collaboration across those teams and why it is so very important in order to scale well.
That's great. I want to actually use that as a jump off point for another question I had for you around what makes resilient, cohesive teams. So, in your experience, what kind of environment do people grow and stay engaged in? And what does that healthy culture around growth look like versus the teams that are more brittle? They don't have that psychological safety, right? Even speaking from recent experiences or some specific examples of both the resilient team and the behaviors that they model and what you see there versus a team that you can already see is going to have some problems down the line.
Yeah. And psychological safety was the term I was going to bring up, and it might invoke a lot of like new age sensitivity or whatever. But at its core, I think it is resilient teams have the freedom to fail. They have the runway to explore a possibility mindset because oftentimes the kinds of organizations I've tended to work with are exploring a solution to a problem either for the first time or amongst a small group of other players who are doing a similar work. And so the freedom to explore solutions, however unconventional they may be, whether they're viable or not, and being able to do so without the freedom to fail and some degree of self-awareness, understanding limitations in doing it, identifying what sort of contingencies are at play, what might we need to pull these things off, what I can do well, and some areas that give me concern. Giving room for those kinds of conversations creates those teams that are resilient enough to trust one another. I've certainly seen teams where, and I'll use an example here. This is certainly not something that holds true 100% of the time, but you get these ultra brilliant, highly technical founders who might come out of a highly pedigreed program as a PhD in a certain discipline. They're so wildly bright, and perhaps their tolerance for failure and understanding how people might engage with them create teams that are afraid to explore because they're working with someone who may not understand how to get the best of the people around them and how best to mobilize people in other disciplines to explore those kinds of things. And so it is this self-awareness of I'm good in this area. And I'll often say this to teams. Again, I'll come back to the construction technology company we're working with right now. I know nothing about the way that construction needs to be done. And so my approach with those teams tends to be I'm here because I understand structurally how we need to grow. I couldn't imagine how it needs to be done within the confines of your discipline. So I need for you to help inform what does good look like when we're building these things. I need your help to refine these things. I want your set of eyes. I want you to help create these things with me. And it does give a sense of opportunity for ownership. I'm a part of this. I get the chance to build something better, something that removes the tension that I've been feeling. And so that psychological safety is so important for these teams that are resilient. The ones that are brittle tend to feel less of an investment because what does it matter? What I bring to the table, I'm either undermined, there's not that sense of trust, my opportunity for impact is fairly limited, and or I'm afraid to take a step that might impact my ability to hold this job at all. So I'm going to do something that keeps me out of the crosshairs and not take those calculated risks because there's no risk tolerance there to begin with.
That's interesting. Your last point there made me think about a recent interview from the organization I work for, Long Angle. They interviewed a pretty well-renowned Hollywood producer, and they basically asked him like, why do bad movies get made, like the sequels, right? The bad sequels. And he was talking about how in that domain, a lot of these producers will get greenlit for films that are sequels that were known entities, known hits, because it's less risky to do a sequel of a Marvel movie, let's say. But it's more risky, and especially as a up and coming producer, to pitch something brand new that could either like be a super hit or a super flop, because it's the movie making business is very much a hits business. And so it kind of just reminds me of that point you were making around, are you building an organization that is allowing you to take bets, to take calculated risks, or are you creating an environment where you're kind of creating mediocre work because there's a standard and you don't want to get fired and that kind of thing? In my experience working with Long Angle, they've really created that psychological safety for me to be entrepreneurial within the organization. You know, my role is around growing their podcast, but at the same time, they gave me the runway to explore a new idea around these legacy films that I pitched, which were basically creating these membership mini documentaries for members to kind of tell their story and to preserve those lessons for their kids and their grandchildren. And so we explored the idea for about a month, and the CEO got super behind it. And we actually reached out and had a discovery interview, and we just learned a lot. And we also learned in that process that it might have been a bit of a shiny object for us to actually pursue this opportunity for a number of reasons. But at least they gave me the runway to know that this was not going to work, probably within the confines of what we're trying to accomplish here, and put it on the shelf to come back to as a future opportunity.
Yeah.
So I really appreciated that about what Long Angle has done for me, because if I didn't know, I would have always been thinking in the back of my mind, it's like, this is a great idea. We should do this. Why are we not doing this? And it would just make me feel frustrated internally, even if, I'm very happy working for them. But yeah, I think that runway is really important.
Yeah. And even if that particular project, if in its current form or how it was originally conceptualized, even if it never makes it to the point you might have intended to originally, what I can guarantee is there will be something you will carry forward into another project that you might do that is similar enough that you think back on the things that went well, the things that introduced friction, the themes that you explored there. Like, you are arguably better because of it, regardless whether or not that particular project ends up being a success in any, standard way you're measuring it. It gave you the freedom to try those things so that the next time you have the ability to also be better at it. In whatever way, shape, or form. And I had a therapist tell me a few years ago, because earlier in my career, I did approach things with a scarcity mindset. Like, I didn't have a lot growing up. And so, like, the success of my career was expected of me. It was the measuring stick I was held to with my family, because it was our way to establish a better life than my parents had had. And so she'd said to me that in any decision in your life, you'll approach it from either a position of love or a position of fear. And if you're doing so from a position of fear, you are automatically making less sound decisions. Your judgment is not going to be as sound as if you're approaching this because you're feeling excitement or because you have possibility in mind, or giving yourself the freedom to think of a solution that might be so much better than you let yourself think of if you're afraid. And I tie this back to this theme that I've thought of recently, which is the reason we do this work is because in any job that anyone holds, their identity as an employee enables so many others in their lives. My identity as a parent and providing for my kids, my identity as a business owner and having something that feels so mine, and I have this love and ownership over something to do this work at all. I genuinely love having the opportunity to do it, and it shows in every other part of my life. It shows in our ability to plan for our future, and having the ability to have some sort of safety financially, for instance, in our later years. So it enables every one of those identities. And so to underestimate that is to forget that giving someone the ability to tinker and having that psychological safety hits at the core of that identity they feel, which is the jumping off point for virtually every other piece of their life, and being able to do those things. So for me, it is such a signal of a resilient team, which is that it's a really, really important part of it.
That's great. I want to get to one more question here. You've been through 4 exits, is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. So the 4 here are Secure24, HookLogic, Dynatrace, and Solvi.
Correct.
Right? Okay, cool. And In some interviews that you've had, you've talked about grief as being kind of a part of those exits. This one is for the executives that might be listening to this conversation who either are approaching an exit or who are recently experienced an exit. Can you talk a little bit about kind of what you see there from both the founder slash CEO, the executive teams, sort of identity shifts that start to happen, where they find renewed purpose, if that is something you can speak to, as well as how that exit sort of impacts the employees that have come up in the organization beyond it? Because you've seen, in PE exits, for example, either you go to a PE firm where, they're adding value, they're growing organically, they're keeping on the team, they're growing the team, they're just generating new revenue streams or things like that. And then you've seen exits where you start to lay off people and try to squeeze out all the revenue and things like that. So I guess I'm curious your perspective on where grief comes into play. How is this how are the executives in the exit sort of affected? Where do they find renewed purpose? And then how does it affect the culture within the team?
Yeah, it is grief. I know it is such an interesting way to explain this, but if I explore this from the lens of an executive, an exit is such validation on this work for them. Oftentimes executives they stand to benefit most financially from this. And so there is automatically this excitement over, oh my gosh, this thing that we thought we could do, that we grew is now, it is a success because I've derived, again, validation that it did work and we were able to provide something that was so beneficial that someone else either acquired it or we IPO'd, and also benefit from a financial perspective because they're often incentivized to have that sort of growth anyway. So there tends to be a lot of excitement at that level. The grief comes in because, again, coming back to this idea of being the glue for the organization, everything we do is on some level to get the very best work out of everyone on those teams. The excitement that they have this opportunity to explore and try things and do things they probably couldn't have envisioned they would have gotten a chance to do. And so there is this sense of grief because virtually everything about their working lives will change very, very quickly. And also we both feel it because the culture we've been so careful to build and the structure around that we've been so careful to build will ultimately be handed over to another team to decide whether they want to keep it all or carry along and lead. So we oftentimes find ourselves in this no man's land of where do we belong now? And so our own roles tend to change a whole lot as part of that. So our experience tends to align more so with the feelings of the broader organization than the executive level, again, because we're brought in later. So the incentives are typically end up being less. Like we're not giving heavy equity grants and we're not incentivized. We're not typically key hires that are considered like collateral within an acquisition, for instance. So we don't see and derive those benefits that an executive level would have seen, though we are part of the diligence of making sure that transition happens. When we think about like the change management that doesn't happen for preparing teams for what will happen, it tends to run counter to how like my own morality. Like I tend to think we need to acknowledge that things will change. We need to acknowledge that there will be redundancies. We need to acknowledge that people will often feel fear, anger, and anxiety over this transition at all because change is hard to navigate, especially at this level for them. And so it's hard. And I think part of it too is you develop a love for these human beings. I mean, these people that I've worked with in these startups introduced many, if not all of my early clients at startups. There's so much trust you build and an excitement to collaborate with these people that we're excited to support each other now years later. And so to not get to do that anymore in those situations, it feels sad. Like you've got to start all over somewhere else and do it all again and hope it's as good as that. But then at the same time, maybe it's not as good and we get to do it for longer. So it is it's a series of contradictions of the feelings there because, and it's hard to square. It is different every day. It is the 5 stages of grief for me. It always has been. So does that explain it?
Yeah. Yeah, I wanted to share too that in the community that we're building, that grief is manifest in this sort of lack of purpose where you've been dedicating so many years of your life as a founder or an executive to an organization that if you end up not continuing on that exit and you fully exit the company, it's like it's so wrapped up into your identity that you have to go through this whole new floundering phase of figuring out who you are, where am I putting my time and energy, and things like that. And I think what we've been able to find is that it's really important at that point to kind of let yourself flounder and give yourself the time and space to like renew who you are, your purpose, the things that you want to explore. And then also find people who are similar to you, going through a similar experience so that you can draw insights from each other and share in the maybe that grieving or maybe in that renewed excitement for taking on a new adventure. So I just wanted to share that point because I think it's an important one. Some founders, I know Alex Lieberman, he talks very regularly on LinkedIn about that grief that he went through after exiting Morning Brew. And now he is basically running a venture studio with multiple companies that he's building. And I think he finally landed on 10x as sort of the AI transformation company that he wants to be dedicating full time to. But he's also a new father. So he decided, I'm going to make being a great father, a great husband, plan A for this whole development of this new organization that he's building, which I find fascinating that he has that self-awareness. And money doesn't really mean much to him at that point because he's been successful, right? So he can afford to prioritize those things in a new way as well.
Yeah. The purpose part of this is also super important. I'm glad you mentioned that. And I think maybe it reminds me of you see an artist who has some success with their first album or any album really. And it becomes this pressure of, can I replicate that? Because my identity rests on being able to do this well again. And so the idea of purpose and seeing like the now what consideration, how am I going to do something like this again? What else does bring me purpose? Like, being a parent. If money weren't an object, what would I spend my time doing? It's asking yourself a lot of tough questions and letting yourself sit with that grief, which is hard to do. There are plenty of people out there that would just go on to the next, bury that sort of feeling and not reconcile why. Why am I feeling this way? And what is it that I can do moving forward to help get ahead of it or identify what I love most about that sort of journey and how I can carry that forward into other identities. So it doesn't become I'm putting all my eggs in this basket scenario. I understand that purpose can absolutely manifest beautifully in parenthood. And being able to explore that as an identity of equal importance. So yeah, the purpose piece is a really interesting and powerful part of this as well.
That's great.
Yeah.
All right, let's wrap here. So Abby, where can people learn more about what you're doing at SproutWise? What's the best way for people to get in touch if they're interested in meeting you, learning more, potentially working with SproutWise? What's the best way to get in touch?
I find because LinkedIn has become this place of intentional connection for me, what I've tried to do is if someone sends an invitation my way and we connect, what I'll often do is reach out and say, it's become a rule of mine that we schedule some time one-on-one so I can understand you, your work, how to amplify it, and how I can be of service to you. So LinkedIn tends to be a really great way to start the conversation. Also, Abby at SproutWise.com. UI, if you sneak in an I or an E in there, I'll be deeply unhappy with you from the get. And then if you want to learn more about SproutWise, SproutWise.com is a good way to learn about our team, the kind of work we do. And we also have some blogs posted about some of the things that founders are thinking about as they're building teams. So any of those three ways, LinkedIn, a great way to start if you want to get my attention and have some time one-on-one.
Awesome. Okay. Thank you so much, Abby, for joining. Really a pleasure. And I look forward to staying in touch and continuing to support you, support SproutWise, continue to support our ecosystem. And yeah, thanks for joining the show.
Thank you, Ryan. And the work you do to surface these conversations, to give a space for storytelling, to give a place for founders, funders, and ecosystem people alike. It is such impactful, powerful work. So I'll turn that back around on you and say, thank you for the work that you're doing. It's so important. And deeply humbled to have gotten a chance to catch up with you today.
All right. Thank you so much, Abby.
Mhm. All right.